History is rarely shaped by miracles. It is almost always forged in the unforgiving fires of extreme human misery. To understand the genesis of the most famous and terrifying mystic of the modern era, we must descend into absolute darkness. She was born on October 3, 1911, in Strumica. It was a miserable, heavily disputed town trapped within the crumbling, violent borders of the collapsing Ottoman Empire. She was thrust into a world that was already suffocating under the crushing weight of geopolitical death. Her very existence was an immediate defiance of biological probability. She was a premature infant, born so agonizingly fragile and violently underdeveloped that her own parents refused to give her a name for weeks, waiting for the inevitable silence of her death. In the brutal, unforgiving rural traditions of the time, naming a child destined for the grave was considered an invitation for a curse. But she stubbornly refused to die. When she finally cried with enough strength to prove her vitality, they named her Vangelia. The name tragically translates to the bearer of good news. But there was absolutely no good news to be found. Before she could even form her first memories, her mother succumbed to the brutal living conditions and perished, leaving an immense psychological void. Shortly after, World War I erupted, transforming the continent into a mechanized slaughterhouse. Her father was forcibly conscripted into the Bulgarian army and dragged into the trenches. The infant Vanga was completely abandoned, left to the fragile charity of impoverished neighbors. She survived on scraps of stale bread, navigating a landscape filled with disease, military occupation, and the constant lingering shadow of death. When the war finally ended, her father miraculously returned, but he was a broken, traumatized shell of a man. He remarried, desperately attempting to rebuild a fractured life from the ashes. For a brief, fleeting moment in the timeline of her existence, it seemed as though the universe would allow Vanga to experience a normal, unremarkable, and peaceful human life. In 1923, the family relocated to Novo Selo. Vanga was now a 12-year-old girl. She was remarkably helpful, a bright child who organized games where she would pretend to heal her blindfolded friends with imaginary mystical herbs. She was completely oblivious to the impending nightmare. And then came the day of the anomaly. It was a seemingly ordinary afternoon. Vanga had traveled to the local spring with her cousins to fetch water. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted aggressively. The bright sky above them violently twisted and warped. The heavens shifted from blue to a bruised, sickly yellow, and then to a terrifying charcoal black in a matter of seconds. It wasn't a standard storm. It was a highly localized freak tornado, a demonic twisting vortex of pulverized earth and immense mechanical power. The other children scattered in blind panic. But the storm didn't just pass over the field. It seemed to possess a conscious, predatory target. The violent vortex physically wrapped around the 12-year-old girl, lifting her completely off the ground. She spun helplessly in the air, trapped inside a claustrophobic nightmare of sharp branches, suffocating dirt, and deafening chaotic noise. It carried her away like a rag doll, throwing her violently into an empty, desolate field, far away from the safety of the spring. When her desperate family finally located her hours later, as the cold darkness of the evening set in, the sight was horrific. Vanga was found half buried under heavy layers of compacted dirt, mud, and rocks. She was paralyzed with profound systemic shock. Her small body trembled uncontrollably. But the true, lingering horror was not her broken bones or bruised skin. It was her face. The storm had forcefully blasted her eyes with an unimaginable concentrated volume of thick, abrasive sand and jagged microscopic rock shards. Her eyes were completely cemented shut. The physical pain was excruciating, burning like concentrated acid deep within her skull. Her deeply impoverished family was thrust into a medical nightmare. They had absolutely no money for advanced surgical care or sterile hospitals. The primitive, desperate operations they could afford in the rural villages were closer to medieval butchery than modern medicine. They crudely tried to extract the embedded debris, but the unsterilized instruments and unhygienic conditions only guaranteed a catastrophic biological disaster. The delicate, irrecoverable ocular tissue became severely infected. Slowly, agonizingly, over the next few torturous years, her vision deteriorated into a thick, impenetrable gray fog. And eventually that heavy fog solidified into complete, irreversible, eternal darkness. In that single violent act of atmospheric terror, the visual world was permanently stolen from her. By 1925, completely blind and considered a heavy financial burden by her starving family, she was sent away to an asylum for the blind in the city of Zemun. For 3 unprecedented years, it was a rare sanctuary of profound peace. The strict institution taught the teenage girl how to safely navigate the abyss. She learned to read the raised bumps of Braille. She learned to play the piano, and she learned how to survive in the dark. She even found a fleeting, beautiful glimpse of human warmth. She fell deeply, fiercely in love with another blind student, a gentle young man from a wealthy family. They dreamed of a future together, and they planned to marry. But tragedy was her only loyal companion. Just as she tasted the intoxicating flavor of happiness, a cruel letter arrived. Her stepmother had died in childbirth. Her father commanded her to return to the squalor of Strumica immediately to take care of her younger siblings. The engagement was abruptly shattered. Vanga was ruthlessly ripped away from the school, away from the music, away from her only love, and dragged back into the crushing, claustrophobic prison of extreme rural poverty. She spent her days sitting in a freezing, decaying shack, utterly isolated. She was forced to navigate the filthy dirt floors to cook, clean, and sew for her demanding family, completely blind. But it was here, in this absolute agonizing void of sensory deprivation, that the human mind began to aggressively and terrifyingly compensate. Neurologists know that when the physical eyes die, the brain aggressively starves for input. It begins to frantically search for signals in the dark. Vanga claimed that as the silence of the shack grew deafening, she was no longer alone in the room. She began to hear distinct, commanding voices, non-human invisible entities that she simply referred to as the invisible creatures. They would stand silently beside her bed in the dead of night, hovering in the sensory void. These phantoms began whispering profound, deeply terrifying secrets about the people in her village. They whispered about their hidden sins, their clandestine affairs, their undiagnosed internal sicknesses, and the exact, unalterable dates of their impending deaths. The psychological dam completely fractured in April 1941. As the Axis powers prepared to invade Yugoslavia, plunging the Balkans into another apocalypse, Vanga experienced a profound psychotic break or a genuine supernatural awakening. A majestic spectral entity appeared before her, a glowing, radiant rider on a white horse, wearing shining ancient armor, entered her miserable shack. The phantom illuminated the room with a cold, divine light and spoke directly into her consciousness. It delivered a terrifying commandment. The rider told her, "The world is turning into a disaster. Millions of people will die. You will stand here and you will prophesy. Do not be afraid. I will be beside you and dictate what you shall transmit." And then the entire world exploded into fire. World War II aggressively ravaged the region. Death became a daily mechanical reality. In an era of total information blackout where husbands and sons vanished into the meat grinder of the front lines without a single trace, the human psyche became desperate. Word of the blind woman who spoke to the dead spread like a contagion. Desperate mothers flocked to her deteriorating house. She didn't use crystal balls. She required a lump of sugar that the visitor had kept under their pillow the night before. By physically holding the sugar, she claimed it acted as a crystalline antenna, instantly tuning her into the exact frequency of their lives. She told the weeping mothers exactly who would miraculously return alive and who had been slaughtered in the mud. She revealed exactly where the cold, shattered bodies of the dead were buried in unmarked mass graves across the continent of Europe. She wasn't guessing. Her precision defied all known logical explanation, terrifying even the most hardened skeptics. The blind peasant girl had become a national legend. Her influence transcended the poor. On April 8, 1942, the ultimate validation occurred. The Tsar of Bulgaria, Boris III, a monarch who controlled the destiny of the nation, secretly traveled to her home. The king sat before the peasant in her shack. Historical accounts suggest she accurately predicted the exact date of his mysterious premature death, which occurred just a year later. The oracle was no longer just a village secret. She was a geopolitical asset. But the ability to perfectly see the architecture of time is not a gift. It is a horrific, inescapable curse. In 1942, an angry soldier named Dimitar Gushtarov came to her, demanding to know the exact names of the men who had brutally murdered his brother. Vanga knew the names, and she told him. But she forced him to swear a sacred oath of non-violence before she spoke. Deeply fascinated by her aura and her impossible knowledge, Dimitar proposed to her. They married and moved to Petrich. They established the home that would become her permanent sanctuary. But how do you live with a woman who knows every terrible thing that will ever happen? A woman who talks to the dead in her sleep. The immense psychological pressure completely broke him. Dimitar sought the only refuge that could blur the terrifying reality of his existence: alcohol. He descended into severe, destructive, and unrelenting alcoholism. He drank to silence the overwhelming presence of the phantoms that filled their home. Vanga, the miraculous woman who could diagnose terminal diseases in strangers from 100 miles away, was forced to sit in the darkness of her own home, helplessly listening to her husband's liver shut down day by day. She knew exactly when he would die, down to the minute, and she could do absolutely nothing to change the tape. He drank himself to a miserable death in 1962, leaving her a widow trapped entirely within the inescapable confines of her own terrifying visions. She was left utterly alone in her physical reality, save for the endless, exhausted millions of strangers who traveled across continents to demand her guidance. For decades, she sat in her chair, absorbing the grief, the diseases, and the impending deaths of humanity. She became a prisoner of her own omniscience. A woman who lost her eyes to a storm, only to be forced to watch the endless suffering of the world until her final breath on August 11, 1996. She died of breast cancer, a fate she had predicted years prior. Vanga was a child who was never supposed to live, a girl who was robbed of the light. But in the absolute architecture of darkness, she built an empire that logic could never explain. The storm took her vision, but it gave her the universe. But here's where the story becomes truly unsettling, because Baba Vanga's death did not end the mystery. If anything, it was only the beginning. When she died, in 1996, millions believed the story was over. They were wrong, very wrong. In the years that followed, researchers began digging through old interviews. Journalists searched forgotten recordings. Believers collected testimonies. Skeptics tried to dismantle the legend. And somewhere within that mountain of fragmented evidence, a terrifying question emerged. What if she really saw something? One of the most famous examples involves the word Kursk. According to supporters, years before disaster struck, Baba Vanga uttered a strange prediction. Kursk will be covered by water, and the whole world will mourn. At the time, nobody understood. How could an inland city be flooded? It made no sense. Until the year 2000, when the Russian submarine Kursk sank beneath the sea. The prophecy suddenly returned, and millions of people who had never heard Baba Vanga's name before began asking the same question. Coincidence or warning? Then came another claim, a prediction allegedly involving steel birds, American brothers, and blood falling from the sky. When the September 11th attacks occurred, the quotes spread across the internet like wildfire. Whether authentic or not, the legend grew stronger. And that was the pattern. Every crisis, every disaster, every major event, people returned to Baba Vanga, searching, comparing, looking for evidence that someone somewhere had already seen it coming. But the past is easy. The dead cannot change it. The future is where things become dangerous. Because according to countless reports online, Baba Vanga's predictions didn't stop at her lifetime. They stretched far beyond it. Among all future dates, one year appears again and again. 2026, a year wrapped in mystery, a year surrounded by speculation, a year that believers claim could mark another turning point for humanity. According to claims attributed to Baba Vanga, Europe faces increasing instability, not necessarily collapse, not necessarily war, but pressure, the kind of pressure that builds silently, the kind nobody notices until something finally breaks. History teaches us a frightening lesson. The most dangerous moments rarely arrive with warning. They arrive after years of accumulating tension, one crack, then another and another, until suddenly, the entire structure gives way. Another prediction often connected to 2026 involves nature itself. Extreme weather, historic heat, unpredictable disasters, violent storms, the kind of environmental instability that forces governments, economies, and societies to adapt faster than ever before. Throughout history, humanity has always feared the sky, the sea, the earth, because unlike politics or economics, nature doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise, it simply acts. But strangely enough, the future described by Baba Vanga's followers is not entirely dark, because alongside crisis comes innovation, alongside fear comes discovery, alongside uncertainty comes opportunity. Some versions of the prophecy claim humanity will continue making extraordinary advances: medicine, technology, energy, artificial intelligence, fields capable of transforming civilization faster than any generation in history. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part. The future is never presented as purely catastrophic. It is presented as a crossroads, a moment when humanity must decide what kind of civilization it wants to become. Every generation believes it is living through extraordinary times, but for the first time in history, technology is evolving faster than culture, faster than law, faster than human psychology itself, and that changes everything. Think about it. 100 years ago, humanity worried about survival. Today, humanity debates machines that can think, machines that can learn, machines that can create. The future arrived far sooner than anyone expected. And this is where Baba Vanga's story becomes strangely relevant. Not because she necessarily predicted specific events, but because she understood something fundamental. Humanity fears uncertainty more than almost anything else. We constantly search for answers, for reassurance, for certainty. We want to know what comes next. We always have, and perhaps we always will. Thousands of years ago, people consulted prophets. Today, we consult algorithms. The technology changed. The question never did. What happens tomorrow? And maybe that's why Baba Vanga refuses to disappear, because she represents something bigger than prophecy. She represents humanity's obsession with the unknown, our desire to see beyond the horizon, our refusal to accept uncertainty. Was she a prophet, a visionary, a myth, a coincidence? Decades later, nobody knows, and perhaps nobody ever will. But regardless of what you believe, the legend remains, the mystery remains, the questions remain, and questions can be far more powerful than answers. The girl from Strumica is gone, the storm is gone, the voices are gone, but the world continues searching. And perhaps the most frightening possibility is not that Baba Vanga saw the future. Perhaps the most frightening possibility is that the future has always been visible, hidden inside the choices humanity makes every single day. The future remains unwritten, the mystery remains unsolved, and the darkness remains patient. Subscribe to the Archives of Blood.